tyranny, slavery, and negotiation. Those are your options. You want to be a tyrant? Fine. You want to be a slave? That's an option. But if you don't want to be either of those, you negotiate. Okay, so how do you negotiate? Well, partly you pay attention. So you listen. And so here's another way to think about it. Just like the totalitarian assumes that what he knows will redeem him. There's sort of the basis of terror management theory in some sense, right? So that what you know protects you and keeps you safe. Okay. And so you want to tighten that up and you want to make it rigorous and you don't want anything to exist outside of it. Okay. So in some ways you worship the Great Father. That's a way of thinking about it. Here's another way of thinking about it. What you don't know will redeem you. Well, why? Well, because you already know what you know. And now then you can ask yourself, well, is that enough? And then the answer to that is, well, what's the quality of your life? If the quality of your life is what you want it to be, really, then what you know is enough. But the probability that your quality of life is what you want it to be is very low, because you're still prone to all sorts of suffering and all sorts of ignorance, and you know, you can face that forthrightly. It's one of the things that didn't happen in the Soviet Union, because everybody said, my quality of life is great, we know everything we need to know, when in reality it was like abysmal, murderous, treacherous, deceitful. It was horrible. But you know, so what that meant was that in the Soviet Union, if you admitted to your own suffering, you were a traitor. Well, that's hell. So you can't even let your suffering be true, right? Not only do you have to suffer, but you can't even admit it. Okay, so back to listening. It's like, well, if you assume that what you don't know is redemptive, then you can listen. You can listen because you never know. The person might know something that you don't know. And maybe that would be a useful something. You know, and maybe you have something to say that they don't know that would be useful. You know, now there's some presuppositions that go along with that. It's like you have to be willing to meet the other person in the space between cultures. And you have to know how to operate in the space between cultures. And that's part of the hero myth, by the way. If you're a hero of the right form, you know how to operate in the space between cultures. Well, then how do you operate there? Well, I think we know. What makes cultures rich? Trust. What makes trust possible? Honesty. You know, you want natural resources? There's nothing more valuable than trust and honesty. Why is the world poor? Corruption. That's why. All the poor countries, almost all the poor countries are corrupt. Part of the reason they're poor is because they're corrupt. Now, you know, you might say, well, are the Western countries so uncorrupt? It's like, well, they've got their problems, but generally the answer is they're not corrupt. So eBay is a good example of that. You know, because when eBay first emerged, people thought, you send me junk and I send you a check that bounces. So that's the end of eBay, right? So these third-party, I can't remember what they're called, agents set themselves up so that you could pay them a fraction of the price, and they would get the check and the product, validate them, and ship them off. And, you know, they'd take 10% or whatever. There's a particular name for people who do that, like it's a profession. Anyways, what happened was the average rate of honesty on eBay was so high that that was useless. It's like the default was, I won't screw you. And that was between strangers who had never met, and even more weirdly, were never going to engage in another transaction. So what that meant was that eBay all of a sudden became insanely valuable because people would trade property. Now, reputation markers soon evolved. But and I do believe that in the West, the default is, you won't screw me. Now, and that means that I can trust your persona. If the default is, you will screw me, then I'm a barrel of snakes and you're a barrel of snakes, and we will never get anywhere.
Exactly, but this is, I mean, if we talk about the state of the world,
yeah,
most of humanity does not live in the West where the default assumption is, I can probably trust this person.
Yeah.
What are the lessons to learn from what you're arguing and from what you've extrapolated from your experience for these contexts?
Okay, I mean, I can only speak about that at the most general level, because what to do in any particular circumstance, that's the sort of problem I deal with in my clinical practice all the time. It's like, here's this insanely complicated circumstance. It usually has nothing to do with mental illness. It's just the person is caught in something ridiculously complex. Like, you know, their aunt is sick at home, their husband just lost his job and they have an illness. It's like, oh my God, it's horrible, are they mentally ill? No, it's just awful. So how do you weave your way through an awful situation? Well, the particulars matter a lot. And so you have to do strategic analysis, paying attention to the details. But, okay, so that's the particulars. So what's the general case? Well, the general case is maybe don't falsify your relationship with being to the degree that you can manage that. Now, one of the things that I tell my students is try solving a problem, fixing it. Not trying to solve a problem, but you're going to fix it. And you can fix it. And it's a problem. And it's a problem. Okay, so there's like a precondition here. So let's say there's a bunch of things around you that bug you. And you think, those things bug me. Why? Well, you don't know, but they bug you. And you might think, well, is one of those things that bug me something I could fix? And you might think, well, yeah, and there's another part, which is not only could I fix it, I would fix it. Because you can think, well, I could fix that, but I won't. If you're being honest, you just won't do it. But there's often something that you would fix. Start there, fix it. Then try again. Try to see if there's something else you can fix. So if you're going to beat the lie, you have to start with what you can do. And you start locally, right locally. And you can tell it's the right amount of local because it bugs you. You could fix it, and you will fix it. So perfect, that's your problem. That's exactly your problem right there. Fix it. Well, then everything shifts a little bit. Everything around you is just, the balance between chaos and order is a little better, right? Well, the same thing applies to your speech. It's like, okay, I have to lie here because otherwise I'm going to get killed. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's not the place to start. Maybe that's just foolhardy. Okay, would I say that you should lie in that situation? I would say, I can't tell because I'm not in the situation and the particulars matter. So I don't know what to say. That situation might be so awful that there's nothing you can do that isn't awful. How about in your own home? How about in relationship to yourself? It's like, how about you start fixing up the little micro lies that you leave lying around everywhere? Then it's going to make you tougher and more formidable. You keep practicing that for like 15 years, and then maybe you'll be able to start to address some of the larger problems. Maybe you'll even start to understand what the larger problems are, because that's a problem with prematurely trying to do too much, right? It's like, well, is that really the problem? And what makes you think you'll make it better rather than worse? So you've got to pick the right size problem. So I would say, start with little weights and work yourself up. And that's how you develop competence anyways, right? Like if you're going to figure out how to set things straight, you might as well start where you can set them straight. And you might think, well, that's trivial. It's like, it's not trivial. You might think it's trivial. You have no idea how important it might be that you straighten up your relationship with your wife or your son. You have no idea what that might lead to. I mean, just think of what Stellan's relationship with his father led to. Well, it was awful. There's Stellan. He killed like 60 million people. His father was a brute. So that seems reasonably important. Maybe he shouldn't have been a brute. So you know how horrible things can be if you do things wrong. It's like, well, how good can they be if you do things right? You don't know. Try starting. It's like, see what happens. My experience has been that to the degree that I'm able to speak carefully, and I do speak carefully, and I don't really care about the consequences. It isn't that they don't matter, it's that I'm not speaking to produce a consequence. I'm just trying to say what seems to me to be the case. And that, for me, that's been incredibly, ridiculously practically useful. So that's what I would say to people is like, select the domain in which you can act. Straighten it up first. And that'll transform things a bit. Like you put your house in order. Then you can start to put your town in order, or maybe your street, or maybe your neighbor. God only knows, Start where you can start. And you might think, well, what's that? Well, it's nothing you can wave a placard in the street about, which is a good thing. That's like praying in public, This is more like praying in private. fix up what you can fix up and see what happens. And I don't think that there's anything that's more powerful than that.